Well, hey there, podcaster. If you are anything like me, then you love a good checklist. And today I'm excited to share with you my 12-step checklist to having a better podcast interview. So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Crystal here today. And like I said in the beginning, I'm excited to share with you my 12-step checklist to having a better podcast interview. Now, I know 12 steps sounds like a lot, but we're actually going to break it down into the before, during, and after as 3 sections of the actual interview. And I wish that I could have made it. I tried. Believe me, I tried. I tried to make it where it was like an even number for each one, but it didn't work out that way. But I did break it down into 3 different sections, and I'm going to share with you the 12 steps to having a better podcast interview. So here we go. So first things first, we're going to dive into the 4 steps that you need to take before the actual interview. Because if you don't already know this, if you haven't done any podcast interviews, there's actually a lot of planning that you can do before you ever get on live with a guest that can make the process so much easier for you and for your guest. So I like to really concentrate on how we can make everything as seamlessly as possible. And step number 1 is scheduling your podcast interview. So I use a tool called Calendly. You can actually check out this video right here and watch how I use Calendly for my podcast interviews. But this really eliminates the back and forth that you have to have with guests of, hey, I'm available on Wednesday at 12. Oh, well, I'm not. What about Tuesday at 3? Oh, I can't do that. So it eliminates all of that. And it makes it a lot easier for you to give guests your calendar availability and for them to choose a time slot that works for them. So number 1 is use Calendly to set up your podcast interviews. Number 2 is I want you to prepare your podcast interview questions. I have a video right here if you're totally stumped on what do I even ask during a podcast interview. These are 10 questions to get you started, but I recommend at least having a few questions before you ever get on the call. It just makes it a lot easier on you, but it also makes your guests feel like you're coming prepared, right? Like you're not just throwing everything together. You actually have a list of questions that are aligned with the topic that you've decided to chat about, and it makes you seem just a lot more professional than you would otherwise. So step number 2 is to have your interview questions prepared. Step number 3 is to make sure that your guest is a great fit for your show. Now, technically, this could have been step number 1, and I actually have a podcast episode right here that you'll find in the video description all about how to be selective with your podcast guest. But basically what we're saying here is to make sure that the guest that you're wanting to bring onto your show is actually going to add value to your podcast, because just because they have a huge celebrity behind their name, or they've been doing this for a while, or maybe they're a friend of yours, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good fit for your podcast. So check out that podcast all about how to be selective with your podcast guest, and it'll help you decide whether someone is going to be a great fit for your show, because trust me, you want to make sure before you ever get on a call that someone is going to be a good fit for your show. It's pretty awkward to find out during an interview while you're recording that it was not a good fit. So you want to make sure that you do that in the before phase of your podcast interview. So step number 3 is how to be selective with your podcast guest. And the 4th step in making sure that you're prepared before the interview ever begins is whenever you're kind of like in the green room scenario, right? Like maybe you're on live with your guest, but you haven't hit the record button. I want to make sure that you're making your guest feel comfortable. You want to ease into the whole situation, especially if they've never done a podcast before. You want to answer any last minute questions that they have. Maybe you want to clarify what you really want to talk about on the show, or what your goals are, or tell them a little bit more about your audience. But your goal here is to make them very comfortable while you are talking, because whenever you're talking behind the scenes and it just kind of flows right into the conversation, you want to take that energy of them already feeling comfortable and not like, oh my gosh, I feel lost. Like, is this the last, like, I have so many questions and I wish I would have asked these beforehand. You want to kind of tie up any loose ends before you actually hit record. Okay, so now let's transition into what to do during a podcast interview to make it that much more successful. So the first thing that I always do during a podcast interview is I want to thank my guest for coming on to the show. I think that this just goes to like my Southern charm. I'm a Texas girl and I love to just be polite and say, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation here with me today. Usually I'm speaking to busy entrepreneurs or people that have gone through my programs and I don't want to waste their time. So I always make sure and acknowledge the fact that they're taking time out of their busy schedule to chat with me. So that's number 5 in the 12-step checklist, is to make sure that you thank your guest while you're live on the show. Step number 6 is to let them promote themselves. Oh my goodness. So there is definitely a fine line between someone just coming onto your show and talking about themselves the whole time and not really adding value. But I want to make sure, and this is kind of what happens in the before phase, is having the conversation of, hey, this is the goal for the podcast, and I want you to grow your audience or get more Instagram followers, or people go subscribe to your YouTube channel or listen to your podcast. So I encourage my guests to self-promote, but I always let them know it's going to happen at the end of the interview. So I recommend, if you have your podcast format, you can check out how to create a podcast show format here in this video. But I recommend that you have that already laid out in the format of your show, that you say, okay, the last 5 minutes, we're really just going to talk about what you're doing in your business or where other people can find you. So have all that information at the very end ready to go, because I'm going to let you self-promote on the podcast. So that is step number 6. Always let your guest self-promote on your show. So I want to take a second real fast, and I want you to tell me in the comments below, where do you feel stuck in the podcast interview process? Like where does it feel clunky? Where does it feel like, man, I wish that this one part could be a little bit tighter or a little bit clearer. Maybe my guests get confused. Maybe I get confused. So tell me in the comments below where you feel stuck in the podcast interview process. Okay, let's get back to the video. So moving on down the checklist, step number 7 is you want to make sure, as the host, that you steer the conversation towards your goals. So the goals for my podcast, the Proffitt podcast, is that anytime a guest comes onto the show, I want them to add value, not just to me, but to my audience. So going back to the very beginning when we talked about being selective with who we have on our show, I want to make sure that one of your goals as the host is really steering the conversation where you don't go off on multiple tangents and then you're done recording and you're like, that had no value to anybody. And I don't even really know what the conversation was about. We just kind of turned on the microphone and started talking. Maybe you have a podcast that's like that, where you just share interesting conversations, but most of the podcasters here watching on this channel are really trying to take action with their audience, or they're trying to teach or engage or encourage and inspire their audience. So you want to make sure that you as the host steer the conversation where you want it to go. So that is step number 7. Step number 8 is I want you to be authentic. 100% authentic. What do I mean by this, right? Like, we should all be honest and we should all be who we are every single day whenever we show up behind the microphone. But I've listened to conversations whenever someone is interviewing someone and they have an opposing view as the guest. Like, I've listened to this podcast all the time and I hear their guests come on and have an opposing view, and then the interviewer just goes along, like the host of the show just goes along with what the guest is saying. And I'm like, what are you doing? You're compromising your integrity just by trying to appease this guest that you have on your show. So my recommendation is to always be authentic during a podcast interview, because your audience will know. Maybe your guest will have no idea. Maybe they don't even really know you very well, but your audience will know. If they've been listening to your show for any amount of time, they probably know your values. They know your principles. And if you contradict yourself, they're going to call you out. They're going to say, oh, wait, she wasn't 100% true to herself, or she's been lying to us this whole time. So I want you to be authentic anytime you are interviewing another podcast guest. And number 9, and the last step of the during podcast interview phase, if that makes sense, is to always ask great questions that your audience will find helpful. I have found myself in a few podcast interviews where I'm like, oh, I really want to ask this question, but it was totally selfish. And I remember thinking, my audience really doesn't care about that, because I know my audience. I have spent so much time getting to know them, their pain points, the things that encourage them, the stories that they want to hear. And whenever I have that thought of, oh, I really want to ask this question, I also have to ask myself, will this serve my audience? So make sure that whatever questions you're asking, that you're planning in the before phase and you're actually asking during the interview, serves your audience, because at the end of the day, they're the people who matter. They're the ones that keep coming back week after week. You can always ask your guest other types of questions kind of off the record, but anything that you ask while you're recording live on the podcast interview should be centered around what your audience wants to hear. Okay, now we've entered the after phase of the podcast interview, and I'm going to encourage you to thank your guest. This is step number 10. I want you to thank your guest, and this could be in so many different ways. It could be with an email that you say, thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. It could simply be as soon as you hit stop and you're no longer recording, but I encourage you to thank your guest. It goes back to the Southern charm. I thank my guest before, during, after, and all over the place, just because I think it's a common courtesy that sometimes some people often overlook, but people feel appreciated whenever you simply go out of your way to say a very polite thank you. Step number 11 of the podcast interview process is to follow up with your guest when their episode is going to air. This could be an email. This could be something that you have your virtual assistant or someone else on your team do, but you let them know, hey, this is when your episode is actually going to go live. And then going right into step number 12 is I encourage you as the host of the show to provide marketing materials that will make it easier for your guests to share it with their people. So what I tend to do is whenever the episode goes live, I'll email the guest and say, hey, your episode for whenever we did the interview for the Proffitt podcast is officially live today. Here's the link to the show. Here's a graphic that you can share to your community, as well as a soundbite that I'm going to be sharing and possibly tagging you in on social media today. I would love it if you would share this with your community as well. And 99% of the time, the guest is very excited about the conversation and they love to share it with their own community. So I highly recommend you doing this. That way you can make sure that you get the most out of that interview as possible. That does it for my 12-step checklist for podcast interviews. I hope that you found this helpful. I would love it if you would leave us a comment below and tell us the number one takeaway that you had from this video. If there was something you're like, oh my gosh, I just had a huge aha moment. I didn't even think about that before. Tell me in the comments all the things. And if you have not already, make sure that you subscribe, give us a thumbs up on this video below, and make sure you check back every single week as we put out brand new videos. Check out these videos right here, all about podcasting and running your online business. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.